Everyone, my name is Roseanne Tolan, and I'm the local author of More Than Marmalade, Michael Bond, and the story of Paddington Bear, which is the true story about the famous book series creator. It also happens to be the first biography ever written about him. Maybe you've read the books, or maybe you've seen the Paddington movies, or perhaps both, but chances are you have heard of this bumbling bear with the very big heart. Today, I'm going to talk about the research process I conducted in order to find out everything I possibly could about Michael Bond, especially his inspirations for creating the character of Paddington. I had to do all of this before even thinking about beginning to write his biography. So I'm hoping that this will be some useful information for you as you get into your biography unit in class. My research for More Than Marmalade led me to learn so many interesting things about Michael's childhood days growing up in England. And by the way, his childhood took place in Reading, England, which is a big coincidence, I think, that the name of his town was Reading. And anyhow, Michael was a kid during World War II, so the war's impact on British society was one of the most significant events to shape his writing life. And like it did for Michael Bond, most writers' backgrounds and experiences are reflected in their writing. I mostly write about things that interest me or that I can relate to on some level because of my culture or environment. These are the things I know most about, so it makes sense that I like to write about them. For instance, my grandmother grew up Jewish in Germany, and she was fortunate to be able to come to America as a middle school girl between the world wars. And when the Holocaust took hold in Germany, she was very lucky to be no longer living there. So because of my family history, which includes my own father being a World War II history scholar, I've been drawn to write about this period of time and the people that lived at that time. But I write about them in ways that I'm hopeful kids like you will be able to connect with. I didn't love history in school, but I loved and I still love historical fiction. For example, maybe some of you have read the book Number the Stars by Lois Lowry, which is a fantastic book and a wonderful example of historical fiction. When I was a kid, if I could slip into the shoes of someone in a previous time and place through reading a novel, I could be sort of transported into that time and place also. So when I heard about the true and fascinating inspiration for Paddington Bear in an article, I searched for a biography about Michael Bond, but I couldn't seem to find one anywhere. I was very, very surprised to find that it didn't exist anyplace. So I thought to myself, if I've never read much about him, who else hasn't? What can I do about that? An old boss of mine at a children's magazine where I worked used to say, find a need and fill it. And this was a perfect time for me to do that because this was, in my opinion, a story that really begged to be told. Given that only bits and pieces of Michael's story, including his very real bond with his imaginary bear, had been covered in a scattered article here or there, I set about to write a book about him. Writing a biography is a lot like putting puzzle pieces together. So first, I went straight to the library. I looked at magazines, newspapers, books, and I watched videos of Michael doing interviews. I really tried to immerse myself in the culture of London at the time that he was growing up. I actually lived for half a year in London while I was a student in law school, so even without traveling there, I was able to pull many things that I remembered about its charming people, their wry sense of humor, and the beautiful city settings into my manuscript. But if you're writing a biography, or really any book for that matter, many authors will travel to the place where their book setting is centered. Once you're physically in that place, it's possible to put those special details of the surroundings into your writing, which really does impact the overall story and makes it that much more engaging for the reader. Along those lines, I put lots of little details about the city of London into More Than Marmalade. I was writing a narrative biography, so these details matter even more in this narrative format. That means I wanted to tell the book in a story-like form. Like I said before, I've often found books about history and historical figures, at least as a kid, to be pretty dull. So I wanted to write this one in an informative but also an entertaining way. Other than the opening of chapter 1, the book is pretty chronological in its timeline. In other words, everything happens in order of time, so the beginning, middle, and end were easy enough to outline and to draft. It made sense that they needed to encapsulate the beginning, middle, and the end of Michael Bond's life, which I think you'll find with a lot of biographies. However, I decided, and this is the narrative part, and what some people also called creative nonfiction, that I would sprinkle in little anecdotes about the author and his first meeting with Paddington Bear. These little anecdotes all add up to give you, the reader, interesting but important tidbits about what made Michael who he was. Why are they important? Because they help to put you, the reader, right into the time and place of the biography, similar to traveling to that particular place do. And similar to the way you're transported while reading historical fiction, or any work of fiction for that matter. That's really when you write a narrative biography or any piece of narrative nonfiction, what it can really do for the reader is to put them into that time and place. So for instance, in chapter 4, I talk about the game of Conkers. It's Conkers, Conkers. I'm willing to bet that most of you have never even heard of Conkers. I know I hadn't. Well, Conkers was a game played by British children in the early to mid 1900s, which involved tying a tree nut to the end of a string and then bashing it against your opponent's nut to see whose conker cracked open first. And here's an excerpt from my book that goes into detail about this game. Another popular kids' game was called Conkers. Before anyone could play, they had to first make a conker, a chestnut seed hung from a piece of string. Lots of chestnut trees grew in the town's parks, so finding a large, strong seed was a fairly simple task. But not every conker was good enough. It had to be fashioned cleverly, in the most indestructible way. The kids drilled a hole in the seed with something sharp, such as a nail. A piece of string was threaded through the hole and a knot was tied at one end. Then the boys and girls took turns smashing their conkers into other conkers. A point was scored when one seed broke the other seed. "Do you want to go first?" Michael asked his friend. "Yes," said his friend. "I bet my conker breaks yours right away." "I bet it doesn't." He pinched one end of the string between his fingers and held out his arm. The seed dangled freely. His friend took aim and slung his seed. The conkers made a loud crack when they struck. "My turn," said Michael. The other boy let his seed dangle. Michael swung his conker and whacked the other seed really hard. Both twirled madly and the strings tangled. Whenever the string snarled up like that, the first boy to shout out took a free turn. "Strings eased," Michael shouted. His friend held out his conker. Michael landed another hard blow that split his friend's conker wide open. "My conker has 1 point," Michael said. "Now it's a oneer." "I'll have to make a new one," his friend said. "The new one won't have scored any points," Michael reminded him. "So it will be a noner." The two boys searched for another chestnut seed. Michael's friend wanted to find a good one that was unbreakable. They spent a lot of time sorting through seeds on the ground. While they were looking down, the sky swelled with rain clouds. Tiny droplets splashed the scattered chestnuts. "Oh, I've got to go home," Michael said. "It's nearly time for supper." "Can you come back later and finish the game?" his friend asked. "I'll try." Michael hopped on his bike and waved goodbye. So that's all about the game of Conkers, which I hope gives you a little insight into what kids did back then in Britain during the time when Michael Bond was a kid. I also added scenes in which Michael goes with his aunties to the picture show, which was what we now call the movie theater. Theaters were really fancy back then, and they were also places where newsreels were played. These newsreels had a big impact on Michael when he saw footage of things going on in Eastern Europe, including Hitler giving frightening speeches and saying horrible things to just rile up crowds of people for his political gain. Here's an example of one such scene at the cinema. I'm going to read this part of the book in chapter 2. "Would you like to go to the cinema?" Auntie G asked. Auntie G was nearly deaf, but she did not need to hear in order to understand what people said. She had taught herself how to read lips. Whenever Michael talked to her, she peered closely at his mouth. Yes, I would like to see the picture show, please, Michael said. Such a polite lad, she said approvingly. Their outings included a stop at the snack bar. Popcorn had not always been sold inside theaters. Snack bars were fairly new. When cinemas first started showing films, they were as fancy as theaters that staged live plays. The last thing movie theater managers wanted was popcorn and candy ruining their elegant carpets. As time went by, things changed. The street vendors that once sold popcorn outside the cinemas moved inside. Eventually, the movie theaters began selling treats, too. By the time Michael went to the picture show with his aunts, the snack bar had become a regular part of their outing. Eating popcorn and candy bars was as much a part of their trip as sitting in the plush velvet seats. The first time Michael accompanied these two women to the theater, he worried about Auntie G. If she couldn't hear him talking to her up close, how could she ever hear the actors on the screen? Maybe her lip-reading trick would work for watching a film, too. It turned out that she could only lip-read if she sat next to the person who was talking. She couldn't read the lips of the actors on the screen. Auntie Annie wasn't about to let Auntie G miss out on the latest love story or comedy, however. She had an idea of her own. Every time they headed out to see a film, Auntie Annie slipped a flashlight into her purse. The first time Michael saw her do that, he misunderstood. "Are you worried about tripping in the dark?" he asked. "I can hold your hand so you won't fall." "What a sweet boy," Auntie Annie said. "No, the flashlight is for something else. Just you wait and see." The movie theater wasn't far away, so they walked over. Michael couldn't stop thinking about the mysterious flashlight tucked in her purse. What in the world would she use it for? The beam would disturb people trying to watch the film. He worried that she might be yelled at, and even worse, he thought the usher might throw Auntie Annie out. He shouldn't have worried one bit. They stopped at the snack bar, where each of them picked out their favorite candy and a bucket of popcorn. Then they made their way into the theater and found 3 empty seats. As the lights dimmed, a heavy scarlet curtain rose to reveal the enormous movie screen. The first thing the audience saw was a set of newsreels. Televisions were still expensive and few people owned them. Most still relied on radio broadcasts for information. Going to the movies was the only way they could view updates about important current events. Every theater showed the movie only after running the latest newsreels. The moment the first reel began, Auntie Annie took the flashlight out of her purse. She switched on the light and aimed it at her mouth. She'd carefully selected an aisle seat so she could lean forward without distracting anyone. Auntie Annie whispered every word the reporter said, while Auntie G read her lips. As soon as the newsreels ended, the movie started. The flashlight stayed on the entire time, and Auntie Annie repeated every word the actors spoke. Auntie G might have been hard of hearing, but a little ingenuity allowed her to enjoy the movie as much as anyone else. So you see, this is one way that Michael spent his time was with his aunts, and by discussing the movie theaters and their settings and the flashlight incident, you get a little window into Michael at the time, which is a big part of narrative nonfiction. Again, it reads more like a story. So by setting the tone for everyday life at the time, More Than Marmalade includes lots of pieces of British and even world history that might not be discussed a whole lot in your classes at school. For instance, the fact that German Jewish children boarded trains bound for London in order to flee Hitler's regime after Kristallnacht, the Night of the Broken Glass, might be something you hadn't heard about before. You see, the Night of the Broken Glass was the first nationwide physical aggression against people of Jewish heritage in Germany. That night saw thousands of Jewish-owned businesses, homes, and synagogues physically destroyed, vandalized, and burned. About 100 people were killed in beatings, and about 30,000 Jewish men were arrested or sent on to concentration camps. Following the Night of the Broken Glass, the immigration offices were jammed with people, which you could understand they wanted to get out of Germany. But there was a need for paperwork to be completed by the receiving countries, so it couldn't happen that fast. So not as many people could get out as wanted to. Social organizations took notice in the UK, and they put together a plan. They presented their plan to the Nazi government, who allowed it to be enacted for a short while. That plan became known as the Kindertransport. Believe it or not, the Kindertransport is central to this biography about Michael Bond because it set the stage for his creation of Paddington Bear. The The Kindertransport was a coordinated effort between social welfare agencies and religious organizations to identify and fund the transport of children under 17 out of Germany. If the family or children were vulnerable to harm, such as Jewish children were at the time, they were allowed passage out of the country this way. They were primarily moved by rail, then crossed the English Channel and arrived in London. There was actually a Kindertransport Association that even kept track of the stories and whereabouts of all these kids that I believe it still exists today, that association. The transport ended with the start of World War II in 1939, and altogether about 10,000 children were transported and saved this way, which is absolutely amazing. What did this have to do with Paddington Bear? Well, Michael Bond always remembered scenes from his childhood of children flooding off the train to safety in London. They had nothing but a single suitcase and an ID card around their necks in the hopes that a family would take them in. Paddington, an orphan bear from Peru, also sat at the railway station at the beginning of the very first Paddington book with a single suitcase and a tag that read, "Please look after this bear." Schools were overcrowded with so many refugees coming into Britain. Many of these kids couldn't get a formal education when they arrived. Michael was a little jealous of the fact that they didn't have to go to school because he didn't like school too much. But mostly he gained empathy for immigrants and refugees watching all of this happen in his own country. And also his own parents took in 2 kids around his age when he was just a young boy. He later recalled that, quote, "They very sadly used to sit by the fire and cry," end quote. So it was really a culmination of all of this research, from the broader historical landscape to the smaller details of life in London and events and anecdotes about Michael's life in particular, that allowed me to write a full biography of this legendary author. And so now that you know a little bit about the information gathering and research process, it's time to apply it to writing a biography of your own. So let's discuss how you do that. And before we do that, I wanted to share this picture of Michael Bond with Paddington. I really love this picture. This is probably one of my favorite pictures in the entire book. I think it really shows the bond between them and a little bit of Michael's personality as well. So let's discuss how to go about writing your own biography. You might be thinking that's a pretty broad skill to master. So instead of starting with such a big and scary sort of sounding task, it's a good idea to break this biography writing into small, easy steps. And guess what? If you do that, follow my tips step by step to create your very own biography, or even an autobiography, which is the story of your own life, the writing will become so much easier and way more fun. And speaking of autobiographies, Michael Bond did write an autobiography about himself, and it is called Bears and Forebears. And I have this copy that my husband gave me and as a gift because it's actually a very rare book. So I really love that gift. And let's get right to it now. First off, you've already taken that all-important first step in the process. You've chosen your subject, let's say, and you've done the research that I've discussed. Make sure you've scoured all kinds of things for information on the person you've chosen to write about. Again, online articles, paper articles, hard copy, newspapers, magazines, books, video interviews. If it's someone who's still alive, you can even put on your reporter's hat and ask them questions directly. Michael Bond passed away a few years ago, but I still reached out to his family members for more firsthand information about him. These are called primary sources. If you're really not sure where to begin with all of this, talk to your librarian for suggestions. They love helping you find reading and research materials, and after all, that's exactly what they're there for. So here's the tip for the second step. You'll want to spend some time just thinking. That's right, just sitting there alone with no distractions from your parents, your dog, your little brother, just you and your interrupted thoughts. This is the part about putting together the puzzle. You really need to think about this. This step is important because right now you have a whole lot of information, but no real plan for organizing it. Take the time to let your research digest and process and think about how your true story will unfold. This will help you decide the best way to present your story about this person. Again, with More Than Marmalade, although I focused on the Paddington aspect and the themes he brought into the biography, in the themes that I wanted to bring into my biography of Michael Bond, I decided to write it in chronological order, which again meant including the beginning, middle, and end of Michael Bond's life. But the cool thing is you have a choice. You don't always have to do that. If you want, you can focus on one main thing or a particular event in your subject's life and really center your writing about only that. The third thing that I want you to do is to get to the narrative. Since we're writing creative nonfiction here, you can bring in elements of fiction writing that pull the reader in, for example, dialogue. Also, start this by using all of your senses. Maybe you're writing about a famous scientist. Maybe he made cool discoveries while dissecting owl pellets. How did they feel or smell? Then broaden your lens, just like a director in the movies, to those around him or her. How did his lab partner react when it was her turn to pick apart the poop? Did she hold her nose or complain? Let's say you're writing an autobiography and you love to bake, and your grandma's old recipe box is something you sift through before breaking out that bag of flour every time. What's inside that box? My grandma used old index cards in her recipe box, and they had kind of yellowed. They were always smudged with dried up cake batter. Or maybe you love riding your bike around the block, but is there something you've seen on a particular trek through the neighborhood that truly captured your attention? Like a new gosling trying to paddle after its mama in the pond, like we see around my neighborhood, or a stray dog searching for home. Again, tangible details like this can make your writing more intriguing for a reader. It can make it really come alive on the page. One simple scene is a great way to introduce all the intricate pieces of telling a story, even a biography, a true story. Believe it or not, an entire biography can develop from one simple scene, like the aha moment the famous scientist who dissected the owl pellets made when he made that big discovery. So now you have your research done and your ideas for how to organize the story and some details as well, including setting up a particular scene, or it could be a theme, such as my theme of the kids coming off the Kindertransport in London, which was the inspiration for Paddington Bear. So whether it's a scene or it's a theme that your whole book centers around, now you can begin. And here comes the fun part, start writing. Maybe you'll have your laptop in front of you, or maybe a pen and paper. Maybe you'll sit on your beanbag chair or at a desk with a pillow behind you. Or if your siblings are loud and your dad's on the phone with work, go outside. Find a tree, lean up against the trunk, and get started. It does not matter where you're at. Just make sure it's a place where you'll be able to make some magic without interruption from your little brother or your mom or dad. And I don't know if you can hear my dog barking, but that too. And then begin. And I'll say it again, begin. And while you're writing, don't forget to keep a running list of what sources you've used. This will become your bibliography, which will give credit to all of the books and articles that have contributed to your narrative biography. And the bibliography is very important because you really do need to list all of your sources in whether it's an article or the back of a book so that people can reference them later and make sure that there actually is truth to your story and accuracy. Oh, and one last suggestion. When you've finished, read your scene or your story out loud to yourself. It doesn't matter if your little brother or your baby sister thinks that you're crazy, just read it out loud. That's a helpful tool in the editing process, which means working on your scene or story until it's as good as it can be. When it comes to being a full-fledged author, believe it or not, that process, also called revision, is just as important, if not more so, as the very first draft of the biography or story that you'll write. So I'll save the revising and editing process for another video because there's a lot to discuss there. But thank you for watching this one. I hope you really enjoyed it, and to check out my book, More Than Marmalade, about the incredible British author who created Paddington Bear, you can visit my website at www.roseannetolin.com. So that's RosanneTolin.com. And also, I'd love for you to share some of your true life stories with me. You can contact me through my website at any time with questions or to show me the work that you've done on your biographies. Bye for now, and happy biography writing, everyone. Thanks.